Hello and welcome to this section on constructor and destructor. So let's understand how do you write constructor and destructor in a class and what is it all about. Explain constructor and destructor, define and call constructor and destructor, initialize the class properties with constructor. You'll understand what is the purpose of this constructor and destructor in class. Then we'll work through examples, exercises and all the resources and practical tests using constructor and destructor. Okay, this is a very important concept in class, so don't miss this section and try to understand how to write constructor and destructor for a class. Hello and welcome to the lecture on what is constructor. So let's understand what is constructor and how we're gonna use it and what is the purpose of it. So every class has something called as magic methods, which gets called automatically. What are magic methods? Magic methods are methods that is already available for you in the class. In the previous section, we saw there's a property called $this, which was already available in the class. We didn't define it. We didn't tell PHP to load this $this into our class, but it was readily available to access the object. Similarly, there are some methods which are not visible in the class but already available for us to use. Okay, those are called as magic methods because they are predefined. Whenever you create a class, it's already available for us to use. Okay, so constructors are basically called as magic methods, which gets loaded automatically when the instance of a class is created. So this line where you basically write $object is equal to new class name, that's when the constructors are basically executed. And constructors are basically magic methods which is predefinedly available in your program. You can try to write it, and when you write it, you don't have to call it specifically. It's automatically been called by the PHP, and when it is called when the instance of a class is created. So you have to remember this. Constructors are magic methods. And how do we call a constructor? So constructor is called when an instance of a class is created. This is a very classic question. Someone will ask you on the definition of what is constructor and when it is called. This is the classic answer for it. Constructors are magic methods. It's called when the instance of a class is created. You don't have to specifically call constructor. It's automatically being called. And the main purpose of constructor is to initialize the properties of the class. You have to remember the purpose as well. Sometimes you try to skip it. Sometimes you try to write it. You have to understand why sometimes you have to really use constructor. And the main purpose of writing a constructor in a class is to initialize the properties of a class. Let's say you are writing a bank class, and bank class basically when you create a new account of a bank, the balance you want to have starting with 0 or could be a fixed amount, and that can be controlled from the constructor because that is the initialization of the class. That's where the class objects get created. And when the class objects get created, what are the values that you want to assign to those properties of the class? And that's all handled by the constructor. Okay, so a couple of things you have to remember for constructors. Constructors are magic methods which gets automatically loaded. You don't have to call them specifically. And when they get loaded, when the instance of a class is created. And what is the purpose of constructor? They are used to initialize the property of the class. And one more thing is you can choose to define the constructor method or ignore it because it is optional to define. Previously when we created bank example, employee example, student and all those examples of classes that we created, we never defined constructor. It was available for us to define it, but we never defined it. So it's an optional that you can choose to define it or you can choose to ignore it as well. Okay, so let's look at an example of how the constructor can be defined. So how to define a constructor? So you have a car class and you have an property name. And the way you define constructor is like this. It's $_ construct is the keyword, and then you define that function, right? You have to use the same name and same notation. Okay, you cannot write something else and call it as a constructor. Whenever you write with $_ and construct, this method will automatically be executed when the instance of a class is created. And this is the prototype of that function. Okay, the arguments are optional and it doesn't return any value. Okay, and remember that it always starts with $_ and the word is called as construct. And whatever you write inside it, mostly you will write code to initialize the properties to a default value. Okay, so underscore construct is called automatically when a new instance is created and does not return any value, and arguments are optional. Even the function, you can choose to define it or you can ignore it. So you have to really remember this concept, and you have to understand when you have to write a constructor, first is how to define it, what are the parameters you want to pass it, and it doesn't return any value. Those are the things that you have to remember when you write a constructor. So let's do an example and understand how do you write a constructor for a class and how it's get executed automatically. Hello and welcome to the lecture on how to define and call a constructor. Let's do a quick example to understand how to define a constructor, and then we will see how it's get invoked automatically. So for that, I'll create a new folder and I'll call it construct, and then we'll do an example of a class. Okay, so I'll quickly write the class of student, and I'll create two variables for it, name Okay, let's understand how to define a constructor. So you can choose not to have a constructor as well. So if you run this program, it's very fine that you don't have to define a constructor for every class. But let's say you want to initialize this variable with something a default value. Okay, you can do that via a constructor. So you can write a construct via function __ construct. Okay, you can choose to have no parameters because all the parameters are optional. You don't have to return anything from a constructor because constructor return type are void type, means it doesn't return any value. You can choose to initialize the class properties, and how you're going to do it, we learned about this, and using this we can just reset them. Okay, and then we can write a function to print the details of that student. Name of the student is so I've written a method, and then we have the construct method here. Then we have two properties, and we have reset the properties in the construct. So I'll not call the constructor specifically, but let's see what happens to that value when they get printed. Will the value be printed this one, or will the reset and empty values are printed? So let's verify that. And using this we'll try to print the details of the properties of a student class. Okay, let's execute this. Okay, there are no values, but we have defined that values inside the property. So if I just comment this out, you can see their values are coming. Okay, which means this constructor is getting executed. And at what point this get executed? Whenever you create an instance of a class. Okay, this is called as creation of instance of a class, and at this point this will invoke the constructor. Okay, this student right here is basically invoking this constructor first. Okay, and once the constructor are invoked, all the parameters that they have for this student class will be initialized to empty values. Okay, once it is initialized to empty value, it's stored in the student object, and student object will use the method to print them, and when they print them, they are empty. Okay, So that's why when you ignore the construct, you are basically seeing the value, but automatically when the instance is created, the constructor is invoked. Okay, you can even say this hello from constructor, so you know this is getting executed. Okay, you can see the hello from constructor is executed and the value is initialized to defaults. That's why you're not seeing in when you call the print detail method. Okay, so understand when the construct is executed. It's executed when the instance is created. And what is the syntax of writing a construct method? You have to follow this. You cannot just write whatever you want. That becomes a method, right? That doesn't becomes a magic method. So this is called as magic methods. Okay, so I hope it's very clear how to write a constructor and when this constructor get executed and what you should be writing inside the constructor. Okay, so these are the important concept of writing a constructor in a class. Okay, so that's all for this lecture on defining a constructor. I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to the lecture on purpose of constructor. So we have understood what is constructor and how to define and execute a constructor. Let's take a step back and understand what are the purposes of constructor. When do you basically use them? The first use case of constructor is really to initialize the property of a class. So if you have defined some properties and you want to make sure before any of the operation happen on those properties, you want to initialize them with a default value. And the safest place is basically the constructor. And it's basically a good practice that you should use a constructor, because if you give your code to some other developer or you are sharing this code in the community, everyone will understand constructor. And the main purpose of the constructor is basically to initialize the property of a class. So if you are initializing something in the constructor, it's basically a good sign to tell everybody that this is the important thing that you have to do in order for other functions of that class to execute. Okay, so remember, when you have a reason for initializing the properties of a class, you should always do it in a constructor. That is the right place to do it. Then you can initialize the database connection. So when you want to connect to a database, the first step is you make sure you have a valid connection. Okay, you can do it via the constructor. So if you have a function to fetch the records and to display the records, the way you can initialize the connection of the database is from the constructor. So when someone create the instance of that class, and once they do the instance of a class, they have a valid connection for that instance, and using that instance of the class or the object, they can start making the query right away. Okay, so though they don't have to explicitly make a connection with another method, it's already embedded maybe into the constructor. That's a good place for you to initialize the database connections. Another good place is to check if the file exists. Let's say you are writing a file utility, and that file utility basically reads all the file contents and basically can perform some kind of search. So before you do some operations from that methods of a class, constructor is a good place to check whether the file exists or not, and then you can put indicators everywhere in the program to say the file doesn't exist. Okay, and then you can stop the user for every method to check that variable and say the file doesn't exist. It's also a good place for you to check whether some of the resources are exist or not. Then open the file before using it with the methods. Check for internet connection. That's a very good example of using constructor. Check API is reachable before the connection. Load an instance of a class. Let's say your class is using some other classes, right? Then this constructor will be a good place for you to create an instance of an other class so that you have a valid instance before the actual class methods are being executed. Okay, so you will try to learn and understand all these concepts when you start learning new things in OOPs, and we'll try to do more and more examples. Then you'll try to see the benefits of a constructor. Okay, and loading mandatory properties to execute the method in the class. Well, these are the main purpose of why you should write a constructor and what are the use cases of using some of the things inside the constructor. Okay, so that's all on the lecture for purpose of the constructor. I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to the lecture on initializing the properties with constructor. So let's see how do you initialize and pass values to constructors. Okay, we'll take our previous example. I'll create a copy of it. Let's take the same example that we have created previously, and we will try to default this value to nothing. We'll delete the constructor. We'll delete the comments. Okay, when you are writing a class without a constructor, let's say you don't know about constructor, right, but you want to initialize some value before you start printing them, because when you print them it's empty, right? So you want to initialize them. So one way many people will do it without using constructor is like this. They directly change the properties. Okay, so let's execute this and then we will change along. So you can change the property directly by assigning the value and then print it. So it's also one way of initializing, but it's not a good practice, right? It's not a good practice to directly access the properties. Imagine a car, right? Imagine a car. When you're driving a car, basically you are driving with an steering and you're changing gears with your gear rod, right? You're not going inside the car and then trying to directly change something in the engine. Okay, you are using this methods that is given to you, like an wheel where you sit and then you have a gear rod. Okay, you're using these methods to change all the elements of the car, right? Similarly, when you're accessing an object, you don't have to really change the elements or the property of that class. You have to do it via the method. That's why you should always use a getter and a setter method to change the values, not directly access the properties, but do it via a method. Okay, and there's one more way how you can initialize the values is via the constructor. Okay, so let's define our constructor. Okay, you can pass value, it's optional. So let's pass two values and let's assign them. And how do you access property inside a method? You can use $this. Okay, so this will assign whatever you pass in the constructor, and you are not calling the constructor. Then how do you pass this value? Let's understand that. Okay, so this is how the constructor parameters is passed. You pass to the class, and this parameter will be passed to the constructor, this parameter. Okay, and automatically the values are set, then you can see the value. But what happens here? Here you're not passing any value, because when you're not passing any value, what values does it go? So we just default it to optional parameters. Okay, so when you're not passing anything, it becomes an optional parameter and default values are empty. So empty values will be set to that variable, and then you pass something, then that value will be set to that property of the class. Okay, so it's a very good practice that you follow this convention. Okay, and always choose to have it optional, because sometimes you don't even want to pass it, sometimes you might want to pass it. So make sure it is optional so that you don't have to worry about both the cases. Okay, so once you execute, you can see the values coming up from both the different examples that we have, one directly changing it and one passing it via constructor. And basically this is the recommended way. Okay, always use constructor so that other developers, or it's easy for you to remember what is initialized inside the class. This is a placeholder for you to initialize things. Well, you can always initialize the properties from here. Okay, basically it's not a good practice. You don't have to initialize anything here. You always initialize via the constructor, and you know when you pass in double quotes it becomes a string value, and when you pass it a number it becomes an integer. Okay, So to define a data type for that specific property, you can do it via the constructor as well. Okay, so remember the recommended way how you should initialize the constructor with properties, and if there is no properties, make sure it is default values. That's all the lecture on initializing the property with constructor, and I'll see you in the next one. Welcome to the lecture on what is destructor. So we have seen constructor, now we'll see what is destructor. Well, destructors are also magic methods that gets loaded automatically just before the instance of a class is destroyed. When the program finishes its execution, right before that all the destructors are executed from the class. Okay, the purpose of destructor is to do the cleanup activities, let's say closing the database connection or saving the file, and maybe saving a log file. All these activities you can do from the destructor. This is basically a placeholder for you to do the closing activities, and you want to do a final check of something, you want to make sure you do a clean exit from the program. All these things is basically done from the destructor. Maybe you are trying to write an activity to say the user is logged off or something. You can even do that from the destructor. Okay, you can choose to define destructor like constructor or ignore it as an optional to define. Okay, it's all the same properties like constructor, is just that destructor gets executed when the instance of the class is destroyed. Okay, so let's understand how to define a constructor. It's a similar way, similar notation. You have double underscore and the keyword is called as destruct. Okay, and there's no parameter to pass and no return type. Okay, you should not pass any value to destructor. Basically you don't call the destructor because destructor gets called automatically. So destructor method does not have any input parameters and it doesn't return any value. Okay, a good example is to close the connection that is opened in the constructor. Okay, so let's do a quick run through. Destructor is called automatically before the instance is destroyed and it does not return value and no arguments required. Okay, so let's do an example of destructor and understand how it works. Hello and welcome to the lecture on define and call the destructor. This is a very simple example because destructor you don't have a control to call it, so it's called automatically. So let's define a class, a post class, and then we'll try to just see how the destructors are called. Okay, so let's so these two underscores are important. This is where it indicates a magic method. Okay, so let's execute this. Okay, so you see constructor and destructor are called automatically and we have not made any calls to the constructor and destructor. It's automatically been called from the program itself, and when the destructor is called, when the program finishes, right before that it makes sure all the destructors has been called from the classes, and if there are any activities in it, it will basically do that activity from the destructor. Okay, so these are the very good placeholders for you. Okay, the constructor placeholder is basically to initialize the value, and destructor is basically close the connection or empty the space. So that's the main purpose of constructor and destructor, and you have to understand these are magic methods, and the constructor is called when the instance is created and the destructor is called right before the object is destroyed. Okay, so that's all this lecture for define and calling a destructor, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to the section on purpose of destructor. Let's understand the purpose of destructor and understand what are the things you should do in the destructor. First, the most important thing that you do in the destructor is cleanup activities. Any cleanup activities that you have in your class, you should do it in the destructor. Don't call it as a method and call that method explicitly. These are magic methods already available to solve that problem. Constructor solves a problem of initialization. Destructor solves the problem of cleanup activity. So don't create your custom methods to do it. There are already predefined methods already available for us to use. And this is the right place where you do the cleanup activities. You close the database connection, close the file connections, save the log file, write the activity log like an end time. You can free up the resources. You can save the property into the file. You can save the cache. You can serialize the object as well. Well, these are the use cases of what kind of things you should do in the destructor. And we haven't learned about doing the caching and serialization, which we'll be looking in upcoming sections. Well, those are the things that you can do in the destructor. So always remember, when you want to do some kind of cleanup, or you want to save something, or you want to close up something, or you want to write a log, these kind of things basically are done in destructors. Okay, don't ever practice to write your own methods to do it. Always use destructor, which is the safest and the best thing to do. Well, that's all the lecture on purpose of the destructor. I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to the project section. So in this use case, we will try to improve the employee class with constructor. This example we have done in previous section, we haven't written with constructor. So we'll try to enhance the program with the constructor. For this, you have to go to the constructor and destructor folder. So if you have downloaded the materials, you should find the constructor and destructor folder. In this, go to use case folder. You will find the before file. So let's open this before file. It will look something like this. So I'll go back to my folder, oops folder, where we were working on this. And we already have a before and after folder. So take this file. We will change this class and then we'll add the constructor. You see, we are directly changing the property, which is not a good practice. Now we understood how to work with constructor. So we'll move them to constructor now. So let's write the constructor for this. And we can pass 3 values, that is the ID, name, total leave taken. Okay, and we can use this to refer to the class properties and the local variable. Assign the local variable to it. Okay, so once this is done, now you can start using the constructor. And how you will pass these values to a constructor? You pass it via the class name. Okay, in the class name you can pass this value. So you can Control X, pass this value, cut this, that's the name, second parameter. The third parameter is total leave taken. Okay, and you can remove these 3 lines. Even here as well. Can remove these 3 lines. Okay, now the code also look very simple, and it's basically easy to understand now because you're not manipulating any properties outside using the object. It's all done via the constructor. So it's easy to understand. Okay, you are initializing this class with these 3 parameters and initializing this class with 3 parameters, and all is handling from the constructor. You don't have to really do this code again and again. You're not actually changing the values every time you're creating the employee class, but you're passing that values directly from the constructor so that they get changed via the constructor method. Okay, so let's run this program. So I'm in the before folder. Okay, it works fine. It works exactly as it used to work. It's just that we have added the constructor to it, which makes our code more cleaner and easier to use. Okay, so that's all about how to improve your class with the constructor, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to the exercise section. So let's do some exercises on constructor and destructor using the file class. So here what you have to do, you have to write a file class and then you have to pass the file name to the constructor. Inside the constructor, check if the file exists or not. If file is found, then open the file using fopen method, where you'll get the handler of the file. Then you'll write some method to get the content of the file, and in the destructor you close the file if the file is already open. Okay, for this exercise you need to know how to handle file with fopen. Well, if you're not comfortable or you don't know how to work with files, so we have a free course. Go to php.link Udemy PHP basics. This is a 16 hours course where you learn all the PHP basics, right? It's 16 hours and you get a full lifetime access. There are a lot of assignments here. Every section will have assignments and exercises for you to learn. And here in this course, if you go to files, you'll get to learn all these things: how to work with file, how to create a file, write content, save file, work files with different options. And in this section you will learn how to work with files. Okay, so now we are learning how to convert this traditional procedural approach of writing files into a OOP way. So you have to know how to work with files. Well, if you know how to work with files, you can skip this section of learning, but you can always enroll for this free course and then you can go straight head to file and then start understanding and learning files. So once you know files, you can come back here and implement the same file concept via the class. Okay, so pause this video here and do this exercise, and if you're not comfortable in working with files, you can take this free course and then you can understand how to work with files. Then you can come back and do this exercise. Okay, so pause this video and do this exercise now. Okay, so welcome back. So let's do this exercise now. We'll create a files class. Let's create a files class. Okay, I need a constructor for this, and I need a destructor for this. Okay, and obviously I need a method called getContent to get the content. Okay, so the logical flow is first you have the constructor, then you have your getContent, then the destructor. Okay, so let's define some properties here. I definitely need a file handler to hold the file. Then we need file name. We need file size. Then we need content to hold the content of the file. Then we need a boolean variable to say whether the file is found or not, and call it false. I can remove this. I can initialize these variables in the constructor. Right, the file handler, I can call the file handler null. Then file found initialize to false. Okay, and I have to pass the file name to it. So the first thing that you have to do in the constructor is basically check if the file exists or not. So you can write the if condition. This is to check the file exists. So you can say file underscore exist, and you can pass in the file name. And if file exists, I want to check one more thing: is this a file? So for this we have is file. So now you are safe to open the file. So now you can say file is found is equal to true. Okay, now the file is found because you have done these checks, okay, in the constructor. So you know the file exists. Okay, and now you are safe to check these conditions to say if the file is found, then you try to open and do some manipulations of it. If the file is found, then you are free to work with the file. Now you can use the file handler now, and you can open the file. Okay, for this you need the file name and the mode you're opening it. Okay, and you can calculate the file size. Can say file size, and it will store the size of the file. Okay, so your constructor is done. Let's get the content of the file. Okay, now we can say if file found, and we can do something about it. Okay, this is simple. You can get the content, and you can say fread. For fread you have two parameters, one is the handler, one is the file size. So you already captured this in the constructor. You have the file handler and you have the file size. So you got the content now. Then you can return the content. Else you can return no files found. Okay, let's write a destructor. Destructor again the same. If file found, then you use if close, and you use the file handler, and you can write an echo statement here. File is closed. From the destructor. Okay, and that's all about writing constructor and destructor and the content method. So file1 is equal to new files. Then you can say file1, and you can just say get contents, and we'll pass the file name here. Okay, let's do a quick review. So we have some properties defined, then we have a constructor which accepts a file name. That's why we are passing this value to the constructor, and we are checking whether the file exists and is a file. Then we are setting one variable to true. It is initialized to false, then we are setting it to true. If it is not found, then definitely this will be always false and will not open the file, and will not open the file and will not close the file. Okay, so once this variable is set, then in the get content you try to get the content, or else we just return no files found. Okay, so first let's execute without any file creation, then we'll see whether it's able to execute properly or not. Okay, say no files found. So we create the file. Let's run the file. Okay, so it's able to read the content and the file is closed from the destructor. Okay, so all the concepts that we have learned so far. Okay, this example is not about how to open a file, how to read a file. This example is about how do you write a file operation using OOPS concept. As I told you, if you want to learn how to work with files, how to copy files, rename files, read files, and all those things is already covered in the free course. Go and learn about those file operations. But when you done reading and understanding how to work with files, come back to the OOPS concept and understand how all those procedural code that you have been writing from years and ages, how do you convert it into a class, and what are the features available in the class, and what things you should do in which place. You should understand that there is something called as constructor, and in the constructor you are supposed to initialize the values. You're supposed to do a checks in the constructor. You're supposed to maybe open a file. and then once you have the file open, then you can use the methods to read the content, and you should have done your closure part correct, or you have really opened a file like the example that we are seeing it here. Then destructor is a good place to close that file. So that's the example that we have seen, how to properly use constructor and destructor, and how is the conventions of it, and how it is been called, and how to pass parameters to constructors. Okay, so this is the concept that we are learning it here, and make sure you understand this concept well. So I highly recommend do this exercise. Even though you cannot make it, just take this file, have a glance through it, and then do this exercise without seeing the file. Okay, so that's all in this lecture on the exercise for the constructor and destructor, and see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to the assignment section. So let's do this quick assignment. Now that you have learned constructor and destructor, and you have understand what is the syntax of constructor and destructor, and how to call them and when to use them. So with this new skill that you have acquired in OOPS, let's try to implement constructor and destructor for the assignment that you have previously done with the calculator class. Let's enhance your calculator class with constructor and destructor and show how you can use the constructor in your class. Do this assignment and share with me, and I'll give you my feedback. You can upload this into the assignments and you can post your code there. I'll do a quick review and I'll provide my feedback to you. Okay, so all the best and do your assignment now. Hello and welcome to the summary section of constructor and destructor. So by now we should be able to explain constructor and destructor, define and call them, initialize the class property with constructors, and we should understand what is the purpose of constructor and destructor and when to use them. Then I hope you have worked through exercises and practical tests and the resources that could help you understand this concept better. Okay, so that's all for this lecture on constructor and destructor, and I'll see you in the next one.